In this next section, we are going to discuss an overview of ESG and its impact. We are going to look at how ESG regulations are impacting the global commercial real estate industry. When I was trying to figure this out myself, I looked at different ESG training programs that they actually have that are provided for free by PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG. Today, you'll hear from Scott at PwC, and you'll also hear from Sarah, which are leading experts in this space. But after today, if you want a different location in order to provide more data on this, I definitely suggest that you go to PwC, KPMG, Ernst & Young's website to attend the different sessions that they provide for free so that you can stay informed when it comes to these various kinds of regulations. First, I wanted to introduce Scott. Scott is a partner in PwC's ESG reporting and assurance practice. Through his experience working in Canada and internationally, he has gained a wealth of knowledge on sustainability risks and opportunities affecting businesses in multiple industries, allowing him to bring new ideas to his clients and help solve their complex problems. Scott sits on the AASB's Sustainability Assurance Advisory Committee, helping to shape the future of sustainability assurance within Canada. He is a developer of PwC's thought leadership pieces, most recently around the impact of the ISSB developments, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, on ESG reporting insights and sustainable finance. Scott is a frequent speaker at ESG events and conferences. We also have Sarah, who is the CEO of ESG Global Advisors. It's a boutique advisory practice here in Canada. She is a climate change expert with over a decade of work experience as a thought leader, consultant, facilitator, and auditor. She regularly presents to executive teams and boards of directors on the link between ESG and climate change with financial and operational performance and long-term value. She is the National Academic Director for the ICD's Board Oversight of Climate Change Program. She serves on the board of directors of Leading Climate Change Canada and Sustainable Buildings. And in 2023, Sarah received a Top 50 Changemaker Award for the Globe and Mail's Report on Businesses. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, let's get into it, guys. ESG. Let's help everyone understand what ESG means. Can you help define it? And can you cover any misconceptions about how you typically see the definition confused?
So it's a great question. We could probably spend the entire panel talking about this topic, as over the last couple of years, I'm sure you've all seen this acronym of ESG make it into the mainstream. And as a result of that mainstreaming, there's been a bit of confusion about what it is and is not. So I want to give a fairly straightforward definition here today, and I think that'll provide some context for our conversation and ultimately what it means for each of you working in the commercial real estate industry, because we want to tie it back to that. So ESG is really about the non-financial factors that have the ability to impact the financial and operational performance of a company. So I'm a chartered accountant by background, and I started into this space because I began to recognize that our traditional financial statements were not capturing a variety of intangible environmental and social risks that were actually impacting companies' ability to attract and retain good talent, access capital, and their cost of capital. So really, ESG is actually about value. There is a connection to value and long-term performance. And we'll talk a little bit about why the investor community has focused on it, because they're concerned that if they don't capture and understand these ESG risks and opportunities, they're not getting the full picture of their risk-adjusted returns. So it is distinctly different from traditional corporate social responsibility, which of course has been around since the late 1980s and quite mainstream since the 1990s. That's really focused on the impacts of the company on environment and society. So it's a much broader social purpose and an expression of corporate values. Conversely, ESG is about flipping that lens, thinking about the impact of environmental and social issues on the ability of the company to generate long-term sustainable value. So it's actually an expression of corporate value.
Thank you. Scott, let's cover ESG as it pertains to commercial real estate. To fund real estate development projects, improvements, and cover the cost of a property loan after our construction projects are built, completed, and turned over. We know that these projects typically include a GP, which is the developer, an LP, the limited partner or equity partner, and then include debt, which is the bank. What are the different kinds of ESG regulations that are impacting the banks, the private equity sector, pension funds in the space, and how do you see that affecting capital? How do you see that impacting the price of interest rates that are offered on these different projects?
Yeah, so I think we heard a little bit from Ben about the transition before, and at the end of the day, it's going to require a lot of capital. So that's where the capital markets play a big role, whether it's banks, pension funds, some of these asset management funds, as well as insurance companies. So they're really, there's been a really big shift in focus in terms of how are they deploying their capital and how are they helping to support this transition, not only from a risk management perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. And one of the things, and going back to your question on the regulatory side, there's also been the emergence of regulation within the financial sector. And just to comment about one here in Canada, so OSFI, they regulate a lot of the financial institutions, whether it's banks, insurance companies, pensions here in Canada. Just about a little less than a year ago, they came out with a regulation called OSFI B15 that regulates the climate risk management of these financial institutions. So there's a whole bucket of things that they're required to do, whether having the right processes in place, the governance structures, as well as building out a transition plan. But a big part of that is also they need to report this and report this out in the public domain. And again, to bring that to life is what a lot of these banks and pension funds are reporting is what is the carbon footprint associated with the capital that they've deployed. So really simple example is, if I'm a company, I invest in 10% of Coca-Cola, I'm consolidating 10% of Coca-Cola's emissions to represent, the carbon footprint of the capital that I'm deploying. So again, they're relying on Coca-Cola in terms of the emissions that they're calculating. So just to bring that back to kind of the building sector and the commercial real estate sectors, as large projects need to be funded, a core element that, we're going to increasingly see from the capital market space is really asking, can we have these key data points so that we can consolidate and really understand, our own risk and opportunities within our business. So, again, I think we're going to continue to see that going forward. And you're mentioning on your second question about cost of capital. And I think there's an individual speaking later on about, some of the sustainable finance avenues. And, the banks all have, sustainable finance commitments. And what is that? And that's, opportunities for the bank to finance various projects or organizations that are providing positive environmental benefit or positive social benefit. And again, we've seen, specific really to the real estate organizations here in Canada and globally, they've really tapped into these markets and showing that they can, make buildings more energy efficient, but as well, have green certified buildings, which, the banks love to loan to these kind of initiatives and support. And I think the positive thing is we've seen a slightly lower cost of capital. So it's a really good opportunity to get cheaper capital from that perspective. And maybe just the last thing just to highlight on the capital provider side is I think what we're really going to see over the next several years is increased level of sophistication. And we're already starting to see this. And, the example I give is, 5 years ago, bank might just have a box check. You have a net, 50 net zero goal, a 2050 net zero goal, and it's a pat on the back. Now there's a lot more questions like, what's your interim goals? What does this mean for your business model? What does this mean for the cash flows? So again, those capabilities are really getting built up in the capital market space.
Thank you. This is to either of you. Can you explain what TCFD reporting is? Can you explain at what rate it is required in Canada, how it is then linked into the SEC's climate disclosure regulations and the ISSB standards that we see, and where CSA is in looking to tie to those, and how it will impact the capital markets?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So you couple acronyms there, TCFD, ISSB, and maybe just to take a little bit of a step back in the whole ESG reporting landscape. It's a bit of what they call an alphabet soup of different ESG standards, frameworks, guidelines, whatever you want to call it. And it's probably been a little bit of frustration by the marketplace because there's different ways to report things. But you're mentioning the ISSB, which is a positive thing. About 2 years ago, there was the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, really with the goal of helping to create that global baseline and more consistency and comparability in terms of sustainability reporting. And the really good thing is they've consolidated and converged some of those existing standards like the TCFD, which has kind of been the leading standard for reporting climate risk opportunities and some of the metrics that organizations are doing. So I guess that's really good news, and maybe why important is the obvious part: help solve the alphabet soup, create some of the consistency. But again, linking back maybe to my comments before about the capital markets and the important about attaining some of that capital going forward is they are extremely supportive of the ISSB because from their perspective, they're looking at financial information at the same time they are as ESG information, similar to kind of what Sarah was mentioning. They're actually looking at this information to evaluate the risk and opportunities within their portfolios. So having a consistent standard that they can compare company to company, project to project is something very welcomed. And again, to bring that to life is the CEOs of the big 10 pension funds here in Canada, so Ontario Teachers, OMERS, and companies like that, they actually signed a letter and said, hey, if you want our capital going forward, we highly encourage you to align with the ISSB and look to that as a leading standard. So, a pretty strong message, I would say, from the capital markets. And we're seeing a lot of companies be proactive in looking at some of those new standards going forward.
So just to kind of further elaborate, just quick show of hands, who knows who's ever heard of TCFD before? All right. Okay, great. This is much higher than it used to be. So TCFD came out in 2017. I think what's interesting here is the banks are not starting from scratch. The regulators are catching up, but this is exactly why you see the major pensions, insurers, and banks saying, we want to move toward this global standard. We're tired of trying to bother companies for all of this information. We have a global standard. Please, regulators, align to the global standard. Of course, anybody familiar with what happened when we moved to global accounting standards back in 2010? It didn't really work for a number of Canadian industries. So when something gets developed globally, there's some practical realities for the Canadian economy, which of course is pretty heavily emitting natural resource-based sectors. So there is some right sizing required. And that's where we see in Canada the establishment of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. So their responsibility, which has just been established, their responsibility is twofold: to influence those global standards to make sure we capture some of Canada's key industries and those perspectives as they develop further standards, and to support their adoption in Canada, where we may need some modification or additional guidance for its adoption. So this CSSB has actually just been established, and I would just raise this for everyone in the room. Consultation with industry is going to be a key component of how the CSSB looks at those global standards for their adoption here in Canada. Now, Geneviéve asked very aptly, how does this connect to what the securities regulators are doing? So ultimately, the CSSB will then produce the Canadianized set of these global standards, and it will be up to the securities regulators to then mandate them. So they won't have their own authority as the CSSB on its own. The regulators will need to then reference the CSSB standards for adoption by public companies. Now, we've seen both in Canada and the US focus on climate-related financial disclosure, and both frameworks put forward by the CSA here in Canada and the SEC in the US, aligning to that TCFD framework. So this is good news. What I want to highlight here for you folks from a commercial real estate standpoint, for the familiarity in the room, I mean, the two really challenging components of TCFD are going to be Scope 3, greenhouse gas emissions from your upstream and downstream supply chains, and the use of climate scenario analysis. On that Scope 3 point in particular, we see the regulators, so the ISSB standards have included them. We see the regulators also looking at including a requirement for Scope 3 reporting. What this ultimately means for you folks is those providers of capital, as Scott outlined, are going to be forced to engage with those they provide financing to get that information to fulfill their own regulatory requirements. So you may already be starting to get asked about this information from your lenders and providers of capital as they prepare for these new standards.
Thank you. As Canada decides what its take will be and what its position will be when it comes to the securities regulations, do you anticipate any problems if Canada decides not to adopt more stringent ESG reporting regulations? Are you noticing or seeing that capital inflows by the big banks or net zero signatories, which may be based in other regions like the EU, where the CSRD and FRAG reporting requirements are occurring, are flowing into regions with more stringent ESG reporting regulations? So if we decide not to adopt more stringent reporting regulations, are you anticipating that there will be capital moving towards other markets where there are those regulations?
So maybe I can comment first on that. And I would say no. So I think what we're kind of seeing right now, and especially in the commercial real estate space in Canada, companies are moving full steam ahead on the ESG front and reporting things, building out initiatives and strategies. And a lot of that's driven by those other key stakeholders they're focusing on, I would say. So, one being customers. If you're a real estate company, you have large tenants, some of them large institutional tenants that might have their own commitments. So making your properties attractive to some of those is a key part. You're also seeing on the investor side, we talked a lot about that, about attaining capital. So, that's a driving factor even before the regulatory front. And then finally, employees is another one. I think, for those large human capital driven businesses, we've kind of seen that, and there's various studies globally that support that companies want to work for organizations that, perform well in ESG. So again, more of a talent attraction and retention piece linked to it. But in terms of are we going to see more capital going to, certain regions that have higher ESG or more stringent ESG regulation, like the EU, for example? And it's a tough question to ask, because with increased regulation, there's increased cost associated with that too. So there's certainly, I would say, a balance that needs to take place so that it doesn't, stop capital from coming in. Because how the EU regulation is set up, for example, is even if you have small investments within the EU and you're not a publicly listed organization, you're on the hook for some of the regulation, and there's a cost associated with that. So, I think as investors are looking at it as well too, is they're also kind of managing, the balance between that is there is a cost associated with complying with some of this regulation. But at least I would say in the Canadian marketplace, companies are kind of moving full steam ahead, and it's really driven by their key stakeholders.
Yeah, I would definitely echo Scott's comments. I would make a few additional ones. So Scott referenced the leadership of the Canadian pensions. In this country, we punch well above our weight on the global scale with respect to our pensions and the outsized influence that our institutional investors have as a result. They have driven this on a voluntary basis. Why? Not out of a desire to save the planet, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you stand on the spectrum, but because they believe it's impacting their risk-adjusted returns, full stop. So they're not going to change their approach or their belief in this because they think that climate change is posing systemic long-term financial risk. Now, what is interesting is capital is global. And so even though these are Canadian pensions, and to Scott's point, I don't see, the CPP, our Canadian Pension Board, divesting from Canada, for example. However, there is a practical reality that I've observed in working with clients. Institutional investors take the highest bar. So if they're able to get a level of disclosure from their EU counterparts, they're going to try and push companies to provide it, even if the regulations are not requiring it, because they want to be able to compare holistically investments in different geographies. So even though the regulatory bar could be lower here in Canada, depending on how we land, I think institutional investors are going to be incredibly savvy at looking at global regulations and asking for additional data points. And I think it is important just to be aware that kind of they take that highest bar of disclosure and seek to push companies to provide that information so they can compare apples to apples.
Scott, can you help explain the connection between IFRS, the ISSB, and the importance, or I guess kind of the market signal of having the support of IOSCO, what IOSCO is, and about the different countries who have already said that they intend to adopt the ISSB standards?
Yeah, so IOSCO is like the international securities body. So the CSA, SEC are associated members, and some of the EU securities regulators as well too. And they've actually done a really good job globally, through various engagement with organizations, but also investors to understand like what is the expectation. And they came out with a statement, I want to say, a couple months ago, with again a huge amount of support and endorsement behind the ISSB. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately up to the CSA locally, or the SEC locally in the US to adopt and say, we want listed organizations to align with ISSB. And I don't know if we covered this before, but at least, the CSA directionally, I think they've had a huge support for the ISSB. There is that Canadian kind of wrapper and review process that needs to go through for the CSSB. But I think from a Canadian perspective, it's likely materially where we're going to align. And you're starting to see other countries around the world come out with similar statements and regulators. So I would say IOSCO has kind of been good in doing some of that endorsement. And maybe one other kind of additional point just to mention on the IOSCO front is when they did some of this global investor engagement to say, well, what are your thoughts on the sustainability, market and the reporting, and what information are you looking for? And one of the things that was noted is, yes, there's absolutely a need for more sustainability information to be reporting. But a big part is there's a need for more reliable sustainability reporting. So what that means is there's going to be increased requirements for verification, assurance, which again is a whole other kind of ballpark in terms of making sure your data is sound, your estimation processes are good, but also you have the right processes, controls in place to help stand up to that kind of third-party assurance process. So I would say that's something that we continue to see develop, and then it's closely aligned with some of the ISSB stuff that we're starting to see, because in the financial statement world, for example, there's verification over financial statements in accordance with IFRS. And again, the ISSB standards have been kind of designed with that in mindset. Is there going to be a future state where companies are having their sustainability reports assured in alignment with the ISSB? So a lots more to come with regards to that, I would say.
Can I add a comment to that one? Okay, so I would say, in addition, I think the interesting piece with all of this is that, as I said, the regulators are actually playing catch up here. And I'm sure many of us, given the level of sophistication, folks know all about TCFD. A lot of the regulations are in response to greenwashing because it's been voluntary and we've seen these reports. And so Geneviéve says, define greenwashing. It's a good That's a good cue. So a lot of the time with all these voluntary reports, I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen them. They're 200 pages. They have some fantastic stock footage in there. I don't know if anybody's seen them. They're beautiful. Lots of smiling faces in these reports. But like financial reporting, there's actually rules around it, right? So what we've seen is greenwashing, meaning companies overstating their environmental performance or making huge lofty targets like net zero by 2050 without any substantive commitments, capital allocation, or resources to go behind them. As a result, investors have started to raise the red flag, saying we actually really need regulators to step in because we're concerned that voluntary reporting to date has not provided a balanced narrative in the same way that financial statements are required to do so. So as we see the new ISSB standards coming out, it's providing more clarity, consistency, and to Scott's point, reliability, which will ultimately result in third-party assurance to provide even more credibility over the data included in those reports. So many of these regulations are actually in response to greenwashing, which has become a major challenge in the capital markets over the past couple of years, as more and more of those corporates have voluntarily started producing these sustainability reports, which may favor some of the more positive outcomes and downplay some of the more negative risks. And of course, if investors are doing this because of risk, they really want to understand both sides of the equation, risk and opportunity.
And on the regulator side, too, they're actually starting to lay down fines. So just last week, the SEC gave a $20 million fine to a bank for greenwashing, and there's various other examples out there in the public domain. So I think that's something certainly we're going to increasingly see is fines being kind of laid down. And for some of these large organizations, you could say, well, $2, $3, $4 million fine, not that big financially, but it's sometimes more the reputational risk as well too that's impacting a lot of these organizations.
Can you speak to the S in ESG? What does the S encompass? What are all the different components of it? Are there any regulations behind the S in the ESG?
I'll lead off on this one because as someone who's focused on climate within the ESG realm, I think that when we talk about climate without talking about social and governance, clearly in this country, we've seen that we're missing the point, right? The just transition is an essential component in Canada where we have a natural resource-based economy in which many local communities are incredibly reliant on fossil fuel-based products, right? And so the S in ESG is essential. It encompasses so many things. It would be an impossible task to actually try and define every topic, but it includes things like human capital management, so the ability to attract and retain strong talent, which also includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, a more systemic social issue across the board that investors are paying attention to. It includes workforce health and safety. It also includes, in the context of commercial real estate, ultimately thinking about affordability and client and tenant satisfaction, right? And these things fit together with how an organization is also responding to the issue of climate. One thing I really want to highlight is with the ISSB standards, they've chosen to focus on climate first because it is the big E issue. But it is certainly not the only environmental issue that they will be focusing on as they produce additional topic-specific standards. So this is actually the beginning, not the end. What the ISSB has put on their work plans as potential topics for the next couple of years is biodiversity and ecosystem services, so another environmental topic, but two very important social topics, human capital management and human rights. So we're starting to see that the ISSB is going to be working on developing sector-specific detailed standards using the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the SASB standards for the metrics. But social is coming fast and furious, and I think if we look at climate in isolation of social, we're definitely missing the point.
Nicely said. So I don't have much else to add other than I would say it tells a little bit of the complete picture too, as well, because the E is only one piece of the picture, even from like an impact and investment perspective as well too. So the example I give is it can sometimes be often thought of being black and white in terms of you divest in oil and gas companies. Well, is that the right answer? Because that's Canadian jobs. It's a big part of our GDP. So, there is a big social impact piece of it. And I think we're starting to see the banks as well as some of the pension funds here in Canada, really focusing on the S to show the complete picture of their investment strategy and showing even the social impact side of things.
And last, the G in ESG. Can you speak to the governance component to ESG? What does that look like? Integrating a governance framework surrounding ESG into a company.
I can certainly lead off on that. So as someone who works closely with boards on a day-to-day basis, the G in the ESG acronym, I always say with audiences like this, we know governance is not a new concept. So it's not like all of a sudden this was something that ESG came up with and it's like, oh wow, governance, what's that? The G in ESG really stands for the governance of material, environmental, and social issues. The word is integration, right? And it's integration into board oversight of risk, strategic planning, financial and operational performance, and reporting. Meaning, if environmental and social issues, particularly climate in this context, is material to the company, it should be subject to the same level of oversight in terms of structure, policy, and process by the board and by management. So what we increasingly see is boards getting education on what is ESG, what are the implications for our oversight, doing a materiality assessment to understand what are those top factors that we need to be paying close attention to, and getting it on the recurring agenda so that they understand how their most material environmental and social issues intersect with their oversight of everything else the company is doing. So it's all about actual integration and capacity building within the board to understand how environmental and social risks and opportunities interconnect and interplay with existing business risks and opportunities and the overall strategy of the company.
I wanted to open it up to questions.
Thanks. Anthony with Prapta. I'm wondering for Scope 3 emissions, my understanding is that obviously it's a relatively new area. There's a lot that we need to do in that space. Some of the data is oftentimes based on financial metrics, right? So like emissions per dollar spent in a given industry category. And I feel like that might paint us into a certain box. Like we might get that for disclosure, but then how do we show reductions later on, right, with that methodology? And at some point you might want to switch over on certain portions where you have better data on the physical side, right? So let's say embodied carbon in buildings. If we can actually quantify emissions from concrete, steel, all the materials in a building, we can kind of come up with that bottom-up reporting. But I'm curious, like, what are you seeing with the Scope 3? Like, how are people are thinking about how to specifically deal with things like embodied carbon in buildings in your portfolio and how that's dealt with in the Scope 3 reporting, and not just for disclosure, but eventually, how are we going to show reductions in that?
My thoughts on that is, first, it's definitely a journey. Like Scope 3 is by far the most challenging area with some of these new standards and requirements coming out. And it's been a topic of debate even on the regulatory side of things. I think what we've seen globally is a lot of organizations are going to have to report Scope 3, but there's just going to be a later time in terms of reporting it. So there is some, in terms of methodologies getting firmed up a little bit more, because it is still a fairly new area to get this information up there and have it reported. And it's really different from sector to sector and company to company in terms of what available data do they have to help support that. And I've seen some organizations who their Scope 3, it's just a big model, essentially estimating it, right? But I think what we're going to start to see continued is more transparency in the disclosures in terms of highlighting some uncertainties and limitations within that. And you're also going to see targets being broken out a little bit separately on the Scope 3 side of things, but also the element of like, there's only certain control that you have over your Scope 3. And that's the big challenge in some sectors is you can create a target, but in certain situations you don't have full control over it because you don't have access to the grid. You can't just completely change the grid. So I would say it's a journey. A lot of organizations are getting their heads around in terms of what are the key categories within their Scope 3 that are material, and then coming up with a plan in terms of how they can strategically find data to help support it, but do it in an efficient and cost thoughtful way, because you could spend a lot of money continuing to try to gather that data, and that's always not going to be, the case in most efficient way.
Just to build on what Scott said, in particular on the embodied carbon, what I'm finding really interesting is some of our clients are the cement producers and the steel manufacturers, and I'll use Algoma Steel as a public example. The reason they're paying close attention to this is they are being asked for this information so that builders can calculate their embodied carbon. So you can start to see the trickle-down effect that it's actually having. Large organizations like Algoma Steel, yes, they're publicly traded, so they contend with also institutional investor pressure, but even privately held cement producers, because their customers want to know, all of a sudden that really gets their interest, right? So we're starting to see data improve as a result of that for those embodied carbon calculations, but to Scott's point, it is absolutely a journey. I mean, there's 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions. Double counting will be absolutely everywhere. What is someone's Scope 1 and 2 will be someone else's Scope 3. So we're really going to have to, as regulators, get our arms around how do we treat this? How do we enable safe harbor provisions for companies where they need to make restatements based on source data from those who provide it, coming up with better estimates and assumptions.
Great panel. Thanks for your thoughts. One observation that I've had is that in the commercial real estate market in Canada, we seem to be lagging a bit behind on procurement standards when we look at like our colleagues in the United States. And I think that there's lots of like kind of global movement right now on like anti-slavery, workforce conditions, all that kind of stuff. Are you seeing any shifts in the market, under that S banner related to procurement, and whether that's environmental standards for procurement, but also social standards for procurement?
Yeah, certainly just briefly on that particular procurement point, I think this is perhaps one of the most important levers for actual change and systemic change. And you alluded to it, but we have a new act here in Canada that is going to implicate a number of companies, both in real estate, but also I work with a lot of mining companies who have global operations, and it's this idea of modern slavery in supply chains. And this requirement for transparency, I mean, as an accountant, I always say the first step is measurement, and then we manage, right? And so we're starting to see more and more focus on getting companies to be transparent. Not only, they're starting with Scope 3, but to your point, they are really starting to embed some of these social issues. And then for the organizations who are trying to grapple with all of this, understanding the interconnectivity between those topics is another area of opportunity. One of the biggest drivers I've seen is, I often joke, it all started out on the balance sheet, right? Access to capital, right? And cost of capital, debt or equity. It's starting to shift over to the income statement, which gets people's attention far more, because if customers are asking for it, now we're talking about a revenue driver, right? And so I think procurement and including it in RFPs, including it in reporting expectations from suppliers, is perhaps one of the most effective levers for change we're seeing emerge quite rapidly in this space. So great question.
Yeah, I would just say I totally agree. And going back to the point is, I think why the marketplace is moving almost before some of the regulation is because those customers, in terms of the stakeholders, like, I'm sure, many of you have gone through RFP processes. You're starting to see these questions being kind of filtered into that. So, that's certainly what we continue to see. And I think the companies that are being a little bit more strategic about it is just moving away from it just being kind of a box check exercise and really making sure it aligns back to their company's strategic goals, vision, and again, what's important to them.
Thank you. Great panel. Ken Karuska, Cement Association of Canada. Just thought I'd provide some comments and maybe just your comments on Anthony's question on Scope 3 emissions. He's very close to this topic, of course. Scope 3 emissions for the building industry, of course, for the cement industry, there are Scope 1 emissions, and we think that data is key. And again, the companies here in BC, Lafarge and Heidelberg, the 14 cement companies across Canada, 14 or 15 cement companies, cement operations, and of course the concrete and all the materials. And certainly one of the things we talk about is the need to have proper data. Our industry has been very focused, supported by the federal government, on getting environmental product declarations for the cement manufacturers and of course then the concrete producers. And we would encourage, and I'd be curious about your comments on EPDs from other materials that are used, all around us. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of your comments, I totally agree. It all comes back to data. And it's kind of one of those things, it's not going to be perfect out of the gate. And unlike financial statements, as you see a restatement that happens, everyone cringes, gets worried what happened. We're absolutely going to see restatements happen in the ESG space, and especially the Scope 3 space. As data gets better, methodology firms up as well too. So, and that's part of the reason why I would say on the regulatory side, they are giving a little bit more runway, because it is a big lift for companies to work through this and collect the data, and again, make sure it's accurate. So totally agree with the comments that you mentioned.
We know that there's 15 categories of Scope 3 emissions, and that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol requires for companies to call out their offsets separately. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol says that companies shall report on all 15 categories of Scope 3. They also say that it is required, and that a company must justify any exclusions and clearly call them out. There has been a lot of discourse surrounding Scope 3 emissions. It seems like it's an impossible task to go and ask every single one of the companies that you work with to provide data to you when they do not all of them have an environmental sustainability team. Can you discuss what the EEIO methodology is and how companies can use that in the interim?
Okay, so a couple quick comments on the Scope 3 categories in particular, right? So 15 categories, and what is the one that everybody decides to start with? Employee travel. It's usually not the most material, right? And you folks in this room know that. We go for the thing that's easy to calculate, right? I think one of the biggest issues with the 15 categories is going to be completeness, making sure that actually we understand that we have gathered and reported on all of that data. When we think about the life cycle analysis of a product and the importance of being able to capture from cradle to grave, which is where we're ultimately heading with all of this. The reason why everyone's so focused on Scope 3, just to contextualize it, is that it typically represents between 60 to 90% of overall emissions of a company, regardless of what sector you're in. So maybe some of the higher emitting sectors like oil and gas would be at that 90%, right? So effectively, we're not going to solve the climate crisis unless we begin to measure Scope 3. I think to Scott's point, though, we're going to see a ton of restatements. And what I'm starting to see is companies getting started and acknowledging the data gaps. So data reliability, data quality are huge pieces of the puzzle as companies tackle their Scope 3. Scott, I don't know if you want to add to the EEIO methodology.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add on that, to be totally honest, but I think there is a piece in terms of capability building. Like that is what at least all my organizations that I'm working with are talking about is, teams that don't have sustainability teams are carving out budgets to hire people to have sustainability or to help with the sustainability initiatives or reporting. But the reality is there's only so much talent, climate experts out there in the marketplace. So we've really seen a big shift in terms of building capabilities in-house. Leveraging off, say, finance skills in terms of helping the reporting and bringing the rigor and robustness, helping your risk management folks kind of bring that climate risk processes and analysis into play. So I think that's a big shift that we're going to continue to see in the marketplace is really a lot of companies focus on building those capabilities and capacity to help support this going forward.
Hi. Is it on? Hello. My name is Benjamin Beckwith. I'm with TKAD Architecture and Design here in Vancouver. And I just wanted to take a step back for some of us noobs to ESG. Maybe a year or so I've been sort of hearing this term. And I just wanted to, basically ask a general question for the audience of designers and contractors and manufacturers who are designing a product, a building for a developer. And so on the topic of reliable, sustainable reporting, what are some of the tools that are acceptable in the ESG world to support the data that needs to go back to the financial institutions?
there's a lot of tools in development right now. I would say there is so many of the tech companies that have come out with, this system solution, that system solution. It's a little overwhelming, to be honest. I've had a few clients that have gone through an RFP process and come back with 20 responses from various tech companies. So the good news is there's a lot working on it to help facilitate a lot of this reporting, the data collection, the calculation. The challenge is who's really good at what, and kind of weeding through all the different vendors out there. Again, making sure it's aligning with your organization, what you're trying to collect, what you're trying to report, but also the rest of your technology stack that you would have in your organization. So I would say, yes, the good news, there's a lot of organizations that are helping to support this, but there's also probably going to be a little bit of weeding out over the next number of years in terms of who are the leading kind of vendors and solutions to help support the reporting, I would say.
And then on a kind of industry-wide level, I serve on the board of Sustainable Buildings Canada. So it's an organization that's about 20 years old. What we do is offer capacity building workshops for both new and existing buildings to help folks like yourself understand the connectivity between your role, the tools, the data, and the knowledge. They're free workshops to participate in that are funded and supported by Natural Resources Canada and Enbridge. And then there's a number of guides and white papers on the website as well, designed to provide you with at least a starting point and some best practice frameworks for the building space in Canada.
We've reached 9:45. We have a break for the next 15 minutes. In the room next to us is where we have our exhibition hall. We welcome you to meet with the different booths, speak to the staff, speak to the different people that we have up here. Thank you so much for participating today, and we look forward to discussing more with all of you.